Within the quiet space where thoughts are born and dissolve, there exists a simple truth often forgotten by the restless mind: energy does not vanish. It moves, it echoes, it returns. Like wind passing through open valleys, every intention, pure or disturbed, finds its way back to its origin. There is a sacred seed within every being. It is not loud, nor does it demand attention. It is subtle, like a drop of morning dew resting on a leaf before the sun awakens the world. This seed carries the natural protection of awareness itself. When nurtured, it does not fight darkness with force. Instead, it transforms the soil in which darkness tries to grow. Many wander through life believing that harm must be met with harm, that resistance must mirror aggression. Yet this is how the chain continues, one spark feeding another until the fire forgets its first cause. But there is another way, quieter and far more powerful. It is the way of returning energy to its source without carrying its weight within. Imagine holding a mirror that is not made of glass but of clear understanding. When negativity is directed toward you, whether in words, actions, or unseen intentions, it does not settle within your heart. Instead, it meets this mirror and is gently reflected back to where it came from, not as punishment but as a natural consequence of its own force. This reflection is not an act of anger. It is an act of clarity. Just as muddy water settles when left undisturbed, so too does disturbance lose its power when it finds no place to root itself within you. The sacred seed of protection does not absorb poison, it recognizes it and lets it pass through unchanged. To practice this is to remain centered even when winds of disturbance blow strongly. It is to observe without becoming entangled. When someone speaks from a place of confusion or hostility, their energy is already shaped by their inner state. If you absorb it, it becomes part of your own field. But if you remain aware, you allow it to return naturally to its origin, where it may be understood, transformed, or dissolved. This is not avoidance. It is wisdom in motion. A river does not argue with stones in its path. It simply flows around them, continuing its journey without losing its nature. In the same way, the one who guards the sacred seed of protection does not engage in unnecessary struggle. Instead, they maintain flow, clarity, and inner stillness. There is great strength in not absorbing what does not belong to you. When negativity arises, it often seeks a home within reaction, anger, fear, or resentment. But when there is no reaction to cling to, it weakens. Like a flame trying to catch dry grass that has been moistened by awareness, it finds no fuel. Returning energy to its source is not about retaliation. It is about release. It is the recognition that every action already carries its own echo. When you do not distort that echo with your own disturbance, it completes its natural cycle. The sacred seed grows stronger each time you choose presence over reaction. Each time you observe rather than absorb, it deepens its roots in inner stillness. Over time, this stillness becomes unshakable, not because the world has become gentle, but because your center has become clear. In this clarity, protection is not something you build. It is something you realize has always been there. Even the strongest storm cannot claim the sky. Clouds may gather, winds may roar, yet the sky remains untouched. In the same way, thoughts, emotions, and energies may move through experience, but they do not define the space in which they appear. To walk with the sacred seed of protection is to remember this sky-like nature within yourself. Let what is heavy return to where it came from. Let what is unclear find its own resolution. And let your awareness remain steady, not resisting, not clinging, simply witnessing. In this way, life becomes lighter, not because challenges disappear, but because they no longer settle within the heart. And so the journey continues not as a battle against darkness, but as a quiet mastery of light that does not need to announce itself. Energy always returns to its source. Every thought, intention, and action carries energy that naturally flows back to where it originated, like an echo in the universe. Energy is never something that simply disappears after it is created. It moves through form, intention, emotion, and action, carrying with it the imprint of its origin. When a thought is born in the mind, it does not remain isolated. It begins a journey outward, touching circumstances, people, and experiences, and eventually finding its way back to its source in a transformed state. This natural return is not punishment or reward in a moral sense, but a reflection of continuity. Like ripples expanding across a still lake and then gently returning to stillness again. In everyday life, this principle can be observed in the smallest interactions. A harsh word spoken in haste does not simply end when it leaves the mouth. It enters the space between beings, shaping perception and mood. That energy begins to move outward, influencing reactions, and eventually circles back to the one who created it. Sometimes it returns immediately through the response of another person, and sometimes it returns later through circumstances that mirror the same emotional tone. In the same way, kindness, patience, and understanding also travel outward, planting subtle impressions that return as harmony, support, or unexpected ease in life. This movement of energy is not mechanical but deeply organic, like the cycle of water rising, forming clouds, falling as rain, and returning to rivers and oceans. Nothing is wasted, nothing is lost. Even what appears to be gone continues in another form. When the mind understands this, it begins to act with greater care, not out of fear, but out of awareness of natural consequence. One realizes that every inner state is already shaping the outer experience that will eventually return. There is also a subtle truth within this understanding. The origin of energy is more important than its destination. What is sent outward always carries the quality of the inner state from which it arose. If the heart is clouded with anger, even words of seeming logic carry disturbance. If the heart is calm and clear, even silence carries healing influence. Because of this, the return of energy is not random, it is shaped by the purity or confusion of its source. When one begins to observe this cycle deeply, a natural responsibility arises not as burden but as wisdom. There is less impulse to react blindly because reaction is seen as the creation of future return. Instead, there is a growing tendency to pause, to witness, and to allow clarity to guide response rather than emotion. In this way, life becomes less about controlling external events and more about refining the inner source from which all action flows. Over time, this understanding dissolves the illusion that others are separate causes of one's suffering or peace. Instead, it becomes clear that every interaction is part of a shared field of energy exchange. What is given is eventually received, and what is received often reflects what was once given, knowingly or unknowingly. This realization softens the heart and brings humility, because one sees that life is not a series of isolated moments but a continuous movement of cause and return. In this awareness, the mind no longer seeks to escape consequences but to align its origin with clarity. For when the source is pure, what returns naturally becomes lighter, more balanced, and free from disturbance. Awareness acts as a protective mirror. When negativity is met with clear awareness instead of reaction, it is reflected back without being absorbed or stored internally. When a mind is disturbed by external negativity, the first impulse is often to absorb it, react to it, or resist it with equal force. Yet in doing so, the disturbance is no longer outside, it becomes part of the inner landscape. The sacred understanding lies in recognizing that what is not taken in cannot take root. Just as a flame cannot burn a surface that does not hold fuel, negativity cannot shape a heart that does not cling to it. This is not suppression nor denial, but a clear awareness of what belongs within and what must be allowed to pass through. Energy that enters awareness does not have to become identity. It can be witnessed without ownership. When someone projects anger, jealousy, or hostility, that energy already belongs to their inner state before it ever reaches another. It is like sound echoing in an open valley. The valley does not become the soundette, only allows it to pass through. In the same way, awareness can remain open yet untouched, receiving without absorbing, seeing without becoming. The practice of not absorbing negativity requires a steady inner observation. At first, the mind may struggle as it has been conditioned to respond immediately, to defend, to justify, or to retaliate. But with gentle awareness, a gap begins to form between stimulus and reaction. In that gap lies freedom. Within that space, one discovers that response is a choice, not an obligation. And in that choice, energy can be redirected, softened, or simply released. When negativity is not absorbed, it does not disappear in a forced way, it completes its natural cycle. It returns to its origin not as revenge, but as consequence. Just as heat naturally rises and water flows downward, emotional and mental energies follow their own direction. If they are not intercepted by emotional entanglement, they continue their path until they settle back into the conditions from which they arose. This is the quiet intelligence of balance in motion. The mind that learns this begins to lose interest in unnecessary conflict, not because it becomes weak, but because it becomes clear. It sees that every reaction carries a future echo. To react blindly is to plant seeds that will later demand attention. To remain aware is to avoid planting seeds that create future disturbance. In this way, life becomes less reactive and more intentional, even in silence. There is also a deep relief in not carrying what does not belong. Many burdens in life are not created by external events alone, but by the internal decision to hold on to them. When one stops holding, much of what felt heavy begins to dissolve. The emotional body becomes lighter, not because the world has changed, but because the habit of absorption has changed. This does not mean becoming indifferent or disconnected. It means engaging with life without losing inner stability. One can still see clearly, act wisely, and speak when needed, but without allowing external energies to distort the inner center. In this balance, compassion also deepens because when the mind is not entangled, it can respond without distortion. Over time, this practice becomes natural. Awareness no longer struggles to remain untouched, it simply recognizes what is passing through and what does not require holding. In that recognition, there is a quiet strength, not aggressive, not defensive, but steady like the ground beneath shifting weather. Non-reaction breaks the cycle of negativity. Refusing to respond with anger, fear, or resentment prevents negative energy from growing and continuing its cycle. To observe without becoming entangled is one of the most subtle disciplines of awareness. It is not a rejection of life nor a withdrawal from experience, but a refined way of engaging with reality without losing inner balance. When negativity arises in any form through words, actions, or unseen intentions, it often carries a certain weight that tries to anchor itself in attention. If attention holds it tightly, it begins to shape emotion, and emotion begins to shape identity. But when attention remains clear and ungrasping, the energy passes through like wind moving across open space. This way, awareness becomes like an open sky. Clouds may gather, storms may form, and winds may move in different directions, yet the sky does not become any of these things. It simply contains them without resistance. Similarly, thoughts and energies arise within the field of consciousness, but they do not define consciousness itself unless they are grasped and identified with. The practice of non-entanglement is the recognition of this distinction. When someone directs negativity outward, it is often an expression of their own internal imbalance. If that energy is taken personally, it becomes part of one's own emotional structure, continuing the cycle of disturbance. But when it is observed clearly, without ownership, it remains what it originally was, an expression of its source. In that clarity, it naturally completes its movement and returns to its origin without being carried further. This return is not forced, it happens because energy follows alignment. Just as a stone thrown into water creates ripples that eventually settle back into stillness, emotional disturbances also follow a natural arc. The key is not to amplify the ripple by resisting it, nor to prolong it by clinging to it, but to allow it to move through awareness without interference. The mind that practices non-entanglement begins to notice the space between perception and reaction. In that space, something powerful is revealed. Not every stimulus requires participation. Not every energy requires response. Not every moment demands emotional investment. This understanding gradually dissolves unnecessary struggle. Life is still experienced fully, but without the added burden of internal conflict. There is also a deep transformation that occurs in perception itself. What once appeared as personal attack or opposition begins to be seen as movement within a larger field of cause and condition. This does not lead to indifference, rather it leads to understanding. And understanding replaces reactivity. When there is understanding, there is less need to defend because there is nothing being constructed in opposition. In this state, awareness becomes stable. It is not shaken by praise nor broken by criticism. Both are seen as passing expressions, not definitions of truth. The center remains untouched, not because life has become gentle, but because identification has loosened its grip. Over time, this way of being changes the quality of experience itself. Interactions become lighter, responses become clearer, and the mind no longer carries unnecessary residue from past encounters. What once lingered now dissolves quickly because nothing is being stored as personal burden. To observe without entanglement is to allow energy to move freely through its natural cycle. It is to recognize that everything arising will also pass, and that nothing needs to be held in order to be understood. In this recognition there is quiet strength, not built through resistance, but through clarity that remains steady in the midst of movement. Inner stillness is real protection. True protection is not external defense, but maintaining a calm, centered state that does not allow disturbance to take root. To remain steady in the midst of disturbance is not a condition that is achieved suddenly, it is a gradual refinement of perception. At first, the mind reacts almost automatically to external energy, as if every word, action, or situation demands immediate response. But with growing awareness, it becomes possible to see that reaction is not the only available path. Between what happens and what one chooses to do, there exists a subtle space. Within that space, clarity can arise, and in clarity, unnecessary entanglement begins to dissolve. When negativity is encountered, it often appears as something solid, as though it has weight and permanence. Yet in deeper observation, it is revealed to be momentary movement and expression shaped by conditions, emotions, and perceptions. If it is met with equal disturbance, it gains continuity. But if it is met with stillness, it loses the momentum needed to persist. Stillness does not fight it, stillness simply does not feed it. In this understanding, protection is not created through resistance, but through non-participation in disturbance. When the inner field does not reactively engage, the energy that arrives has no anchor. It passes through, completing its natural cycle without leaving residue. This is similar to water flowing over stone. The stone does not hold the water, yet it is not harmed by it. It remains as it is, unaffected by passing movement. The practice of returning energy to its source is not a deliberate act of sending anything back with intention or force. It is the natural result of not absorbing what does not belong. When there is no internal attachment, the energy completes its arc on its own. What was sent outward by another returns to their own field of conditions, where it can either dissolve or transform according to its nature. The one who remains aware simply does not interfere with this process. Over time, this way of being reshapes the internal landscape. The mind becomes less crowded with reactions, judgments, and emotional echoes. Experiences still arise, but they no longer leave deep imprints. There is a lightness that comes not from avoiding life, but from no longer carrying unnecessary emotional weight forward from moment to moment. This lightness also brings greater precision in action. When the mind is not clouded by reaction, response becomes clearer and more appropriate to the situation. Words are spoken with awareness rather than impulse. Silence is chosen not out of avoidance, but out of understanding. In this way, life becomes more aligned, not because circumstances are controlled, but because internal disturbance is no longer steering perception. There is also a deep shift in how others are perceived. Instead of seeing people as sources of harm or benefit, they are seen as expressions of different inner conditions. This understanding reduces personal conflict because what once felt directed at me is now recognized as movement within someone else's experience. This recognition does not remove boundaries, but it removes unnecessary emotional burden. As awareness deepens, the idea of needing to protect oneself in an aggressive sense begins to fade. What remains is simple clarity. What is not taken in cannot remain as disturbance. The mind no longer seeks to fight every wave, it learns to remain as the ocean beneath all waves. In that vastness, nothing arriving can disturb the depth, and nothing passing through leaves lasting trace. Detachment allows natural resolution. Observing without attachment lets harmful energy return to its origin and resolve itself without creating inner harm. When the mind becomes quiet enough to observe its own reactions, a subtle truth begins to reveal itself. Most of what is experienced as disturbance is not held by life itself, but by the way it is interpreted and carried within. External events arise and pass continuously, yet only some of them take root deeply enough to create lasting agitation. The difference lies not in the events, but in the degree of inner involvement. When involvement is strong, energy becomes personal burden. When involvement is absent, energy remains movement only, passing through without leaving residue. In this understanding, protection is no longer about building barriers or resisting influence. It becomes a matter of clarity, seeing clearly what is arising and choosing not to internalize what does not belong. Negative energy, in whatever form it appears, carries its own momentum. It does not need assistance to complete its cycle. What gives it persistence is often the unconscious act of holding, repeating, or emotionally reinforcing it. When that reinforcement is absent, the energy naturally returns to the field from which it emerged, because nothing within is sustaining it anymore. This return is not something enforced by will. It is a consequence of non-attachment. Just as sound fades when there is no echoing surface, disturbance fades when there is no inner echo. The mind that does not cling allows each experience to rise and dissolve in its own time. In this way, awareness becomes a space of natural resolution rather than accumulation. There is a deeper shift that occurs when this understanding matures. The sense of personal ownership over emotional states begins to weaken. Instead of saying this is happening to me, there is a quiet recognition that experiences are happening within a shared field of conditions. Thoughts, emotions, and energies arise based on causes that are often beyond immediate control. Yet their impact is determined by the level of identification with them. The less they are identified with, the less power they hold to disturb inner stability. Over time, this creates a stable center that is not easily moved by external fluctuations. Praise does not inflate it, and criticism does not collapse it. Both are seen as temporary expressions passing through a wider space of awareness. This stability is not rigid, it is fluid and responsive, yet not easily shaken. It allows engagement with life without becoming entangled in its emotional extremes. In practical terms, this means responding to situations with greater precision and less emotional residue. Actions become clearer because they are not distorted by reactive layers. Communication becomes more direct because it is not burdened by hidden emotional continuation. Even silence becomes meaningful because it arises from understanding rather than avoidance. As this way of being deepens, the need to control external energy diminishes. There is recognition that life already contains its own balancing mechanism. What is sent outward will naturally find its echo, and what is received does not need to be stored as identity. The responsibility shifts from managing the world to refining the inner source from which perception arises. In this refined state, protection is understood as presence itself. Not a guarded or defensive presence, but a clear and open one. A presence that allows everything to move through without distortion. In such awareness, nothing external can permanently disturb the center because nothing is being held there as fixed weight. What remains is simplicity, awareness resting in itself, unburdened, steady, and quietly complete in each moment as it unfolds.